this is actually a big reason why I'm running for office, is because I'm very concerned about funding public education.
Lori, thank you for coming. I appreciate you. Here we are. You're running for senator in District 10.
Right.
Okay. Education is a big thing. We were just starting to talk about school choice. Why don't you just lead me off with it?
Okay. Well, we are lucky to live in Idaho. We have tons of school choice here. Not only do we have like our regular traditional public school system, but we have both public and private charter schools. We have traditional private schools, and then we have homeschooling. And our state is one of the states, or it is probably the state with the lightest touch on homeschooling of any state in the nation. We are proud of the fact that if you want to pull your kids out and you want to homeschool them, there is no government interference, oversight, or anything. And I know that from personal experience. One year, one of my kids was having a hard time,
Sure.
not with the school necessarily, more like some personal things. And so for the end of the school year, I pulled her out, and it was just like, no problem. And the teacher was great about it. The administration was great about it. And then when she was ready to go back the next year, she was right back in. And I so appreciated that about, our school district, but I think it's like that all through Idaho.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of sort of resources and support that go into homeschooling people is really cool. I had a great homeschool advocate on about 2 weeks ago, and I'm trying to post that episode at the end of this week. I've gotten backed up with episodes, so like I'm trying to get them out. But she was fantastic, and she was amazingly what I thought was so incredible is she was super pro public education. She had expressed that for a period of time she was homeschooled as a child, and then for some reason, something happened and she had to go into the public school system. Her family just couldn't do the homeschooling at that point anymore. And she said, and it was great because the situation wasn't great, but it was great in that there was this robust, competent public school that existed. And she's like, so yeah, I think homeschooling was better, but when we needed the public school was there. And for the kids that live next door across the street who have two working parents, or they just are otherwise incapable of homeschooling or doing private school, you want them to have a good education as well, right? It was great talking to her because obviously the public schools are not something that she avails herself of on the daily basis, but she greatly appreciates that they're there for people who need them today, and they're there for her tomorrow if she needs them. So that was really awesome to hear.
Yeah. And I've talked to people like that too, who have been homeschooled themselves or chosen to homeschool their kids, but are still very supportive of public education. And I so appreciate that they have like a bigger picture.
Right.
A good public education system benefits all of society, right? We want a literate society, we want an educated society. And when kids go to school and learn to read and write correctly, they are much more likely to be law-abiding citizens, which saves us a lot of money in the long run.
So District 10, right? You're split up into multiple school districts, right?
Right.
Because you have Middleton there, you have Star there, you have, again, a lot of different things going on. Talk to me about the public education system that you see and what you think could be improved.
Okay, well, we live in the Middleton School District, and that's where my kids have gone. So I'm most familiar with the Middleton School District in District 10. But because we also include Star, that's the West Ada School District, and then parts of Nampa, which is the Valley View School District, one of the school districts in Nampa. We also have the Caldwell School District. A little piece of that is also in District 10. So lots of different things. Plus we have several we have several charter schools and a myriad of different schools in District 10. And I've had great experiences with Middleton School District. I've been heavily involved. I think, starting from when my kids were young, I was just, a classroom volunteer, like helping a reading group in first, second, third grade. And then I worked in like the PTA, and then I've done things like as a team mom for my kids' different extracurricular activities. I've had kids in music. Most recently, in fact, just last Friday, I'm on a curriculum committee where we are choosing the social studies curriculum that the Middleton School District will be using for the next 6 years, I believe. And I have done that before. I've done that with math and I've done that with science. And that's been a really interesting process. Learned a lot from that. And I love being on the forefront of my kids' education. And I appreciate that the school district gives us lots of opportunities to do that.
Okay, talk to me about this, because I actually spoke recently with Marcus Myers, the chief academic officer for West Ada, and we were talking specifically about like, okay, look, math is pretty hard to screw up, right? Like you got to teach math, right? You got to teach algebra 2, geometry, you know, pre-calculus, whatever you're doing. But social studies is one of the areas where people get really squirrely because, you know, if you start including history and things of this nature, it's like, well, which reality is the right reality? Like which perspective is, for instance, somebody was going after one of my clips on Instagram and saying, okay, but like, what about the great genocide from like the, you know, settlers and, you know, across America with Native Americans? I'm like, okay, well, okay, yes, people died. Okay. And that's horrible. Which Native Americans should we focus on though? Should we focus on the Native Americans that were in like a heated battle with settlers coming across the west, or excuse me, moving west across the country? Should we focus on the Native Americans that enjoyed the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims? Like, because those two groups of people were not the same and they're both Native Americans. So like, there's no one size fits all where people are like, oh, you shouldn't show representations of Pilgrims and Native Americans getting along because they actually killed each other in droves. It's like, well, those two people didn't, you know, and that's not to say that they didn't later. So when you're selecting curriculum, like what were the things or what are the things that you focus on to try to provide a balanced and fair perspective? MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.
That's a great question. I would say when you are working on a curriculum committee, it's actually a really... it's a great, like kind of a formal process. I mean, you have lots of opportunities just to like organically, you know, give input and things like that. But first of all, we come up with a criteria of what we're going to use to evaluate different curriculums. And so that's where that piece would come in. You know, we want to make sure that there's an accurate and fair representation of history as a whole. And you also have to look at it, is it grade level appropriate? Like some of what you've talked about would probably be best visited in college or something.
Right. Like we can teach Thanksgiving. We're probably not going to teach like genocide to the same third graders.
Exactly. So we want to make it age appropriate. That's a huge part of what we looked at. A big part of choosing curriculum is making sure that it meets state standards. That is something that school districts have to do by law, is they have to teach to state standards. And that is a really interesting thing for me to learn about, particularly since I'm seeking a legislative seat where those kinds of things are decided, or we oversee, you know, like the State Board of Education and things like that. So, and I think that state standards are fantastic. I mean, the fact that we have them, okay, so that in a second grade classroom throughout the state of Idaho, second graders are essentially learning the same things, okay? And I think that's so important because people move a lot more now than they used to, you know? And with school choice, kids can just move from school to school for different reasons. You know, maybe their parent gets a job in a different part of town, and so they switch schools or things like that. I know, like as a classroom volunteer, one of the hardest things for a teacher to do is have a kid come in the middle of the year and have been on a totally different page in a different state, and then have to like catch them up and you know, that kind of thing. So it saves a lot of instruction time to have these standards so everybody's just on the same page. And also, I like the idea of like, in Idaho, we think that like in first grade, these are the things that first graders learn. And in second grade, these are the things that second graders learn. And, you know, and all the way up. It helps what they call spiraling. It helps them like build upon previous knowledge. So even, you know, whether your teacher had Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones in first grade, the second grade teacher can know that Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones both taught the same thing.
Right.
Okay. So that's a lot of what we look at. Like, does the curriculum support the educators in spiraling, and is it age appropriate? And then, I mean, there's a lot of different components, but also just ease of use. And for that, I mostly like defer to the teachers.
Sure.
They look at those lessons, they teach a few sample lessons out of the different curriculums that we're considering, and then they give us feedback on how that went. You know, was it easy to use? Did it engage the kids? Were the kids bored by it? Are the pictures good? Are the pictures representative of what's going on in the lesson? And things like that. Just getting down into the nitty gritty of it.
Nice. there's a people are concerned to some degree about the autonomy of the education system state to state, because some of the more, distasteful things that other states have done, they're like, well, we're kind of following like this national idea and this national move, like whatever national sentiment comes out, it's almost, it appears that curriculum changes like at the drop of a hat, which is really, really in my mind inappropriate, because one, like math and how we teach math, or, English and how we teach English should not change based on whatever, social media sentiment is flowing through the country. Do you feel like Idaho has enough autonomy in its education system that there are not things that are getting persuaded by outside forces, like that could be the federal government in general, or just social sentiment?
I think that Idaho does have the autonomy. We do have the power to control those things, but maintaining that autonomy and exercising that autonomy takes involvement. Okay. And it takes, like investment. And by investment, I mean, like people have to care,
right.
Educators, administrators, and parents, getting involved and really taking the time to look at it. These curriculum committee meetings that I went to, some of them lasted like 8 hours. Like it's, it takes some time and it takes some mental work, and so we have to have people that care enough to look at it that closely. And I mean, I'll tell you a little story from the curriculum committee that's a little bit more interesting than just talking about standards. I was on the elementary. I ended up in the elementary side of things, but we were in the same room as the high school. And one of our teachers said, "Yeah, this particular curriculum is not appropriate for our community." And it was really good for me to hear that, to hear, an educator say, this is revisionist history. It doesn't belong in our community. We've got to pick a different curriculum. And so I do think that we do have autonomy, because that is an example of it right there. An educator pointing that out to the other administration and the teachers in the room, and us deciding like, yeah, you're right, we're not going to do that. And we had the power to do that, right? No one was forcing us to use that curriculum.
Yeah, I spoke with Alicia Purdy recently, who's a Valley View educator, and she's very conservative. She's from Texas. She's, the whole thing. I loved having the time to find her perspective, because it's like, look, you're going to have conservative educators. Like that's just the way it is. And maybe they're slightly less conservative than like the most conservative person in your community. But if you have a conservative community, it's not like all of a sudden you get the crazy, California liberal arts teacher, like just existing somewhere out of like popped in, it's like, oh, let's burn it all. Right. And again, I think it's a great story to hear, because I think people need to recognize it's not what we've seen on social media, what we've seen nationally. The conversation nationally has always been like these educators are doing these things. And again, there are a lot of educators that have done those things. Like, let's be clear. The reputation was forged really intentionally by some people. For instance, from California, the school district we moved from. And we had already pulled our kids out of the school district, but we were just watching it eat itself alive. And like you had some of the most atrocious, ridiculous, not only waste of money, like they were spending, I think, $2 or $3 million a year on equity liaisons, making sure there was enough equity in the community. When people are like, we need to refresh the textbooks. Like, why are you spending $3 million a year on 4 liaisons, or like 5, and like, what are these liaisons doing? Can anybody articulate exactly what they're supposed to be doing? And like, it's just a train wreck. So, having that kind of stuff, it's cool to hear. It's great to hear that Idaho public schools at least have some people that are like, hey, no, like we need to be sensitive to our community. And this is, again, revisionist history. Like, God, man, it's rough dealing with this. So speaking of funding, actually, how do we fund schools going forward? Because this is a big question statewide, which is, look, we haven't been dumping a lot of money into education, and we want our education to do these things. There are some people, obviously, that feel like we should just dismantle the public education system completely. We're not going to do that. It's in the Constitution. We're going to have a public education system. One of the board members in West Ada, I love his perspective, which is, look, we're going to have this. We're going to spend money on it. And if we're going to have it and spend money on it, why not make it the best it could possibly be? And at some point, you have to come to terms with, it may take a little bit more money to make it better. Like if you have people sitting on the floor because there aren't desks, if you have, in Valley View passed a bond with like 70% approval through the community. It's like, how did you do that? And it came down to people deeply understanding and engaging in the community, seeing the buckets underneath the dripping roofs, things like that. But how do we fund education? And especially as somebody who's, going into the state level, like what is it? What's that conversation on the state level to help with this?
I love that. This is actually a big reason why I'm running for office, is because I'm very concerned about funding public education. I think a lot of people would say we do dump a lot of money into education, maybe, and a lot of people might even say too much, because over half of our state budget goes to education. However, my perspective is that aren't we lucky to live in a state where we get to spend over half of our money planning and investing in the future? Like, I'd much rather live in a place like that, and I would like to keep it that way. I don't want to spend our money, our tax dollars, in correcting problems that we didn't address in a timely manner. I want to address them and get ahead of it and stay ahead of it. I know that Debbie Critchfield, our state superintendent, is working on the funding formula. She has a bill that's working its way through the legislature right now, and maybe that will get all the way through, or maybe we'll have to look at it again next year. But I would be really interested in working on that and making sure that things are equitable. I have a really soft spot in my heart for our rural schools, and it's really easy to neglect them because, you think about if you have a building that houses 50 students, and in West Ada, that building is likely to be full. In fact, it probably will have like 75 students in it. Mm. But in a rural area, it might only have 20 or 30. But if we fund it per student, well, we might not have enough money to take care of the building, because we're just giving so much per student. That's a simplified version of what some of the problem is. And I would love to work on, addressing that and making sure that it's equitable, which is different than equal, equitable. So
right. And equity has a really weird, like equity means different things to different people in different situations, right? Like having an equity liaison, making sure that, this ethnicity and that gender and this bathroom, as they do in California, is like, just get out of here with that. But what you're attempting to say is like, look, if we just go after a funding mechanism that looks at per student value, then places that have larger costs that are not covered by that per student value, right? The buildings, the infrastructure and things of this nature, like you may be drawing from a large area, but you just don't have that many students, and you're not passing the threshold of students to provide a warm or cool, dry place for people to just learn, just basic inside environment. And that is, I think, am I correct in saying like that's what you're saying when you say equitable? It's not like from an ethnic or gender standpoint. It's like we need to provide physical buildings that this formula may not actually do right by.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Race, gender, none of that matters. But, each child needs to have an adequate educational experience. And it's kind of an economies of scale thing. You get a lot more economy of scale in West Ada than you do in a rural school district.
Sure. Those are difficult things. Now, District 10 is interesting because you have like hyper developing areas right alongside very agricultural areas. You're like multi-generation agriculture. And one of the great criticisms of people like me moving into the area, and like I totally accept it. Like I live in Dry Creek Ranch. This used to be a ranch, right? And it's not now, at least in part, and that's on me because I purchased a house here, right? I'm aware of this. And how do we work together to not just make this like a sprawling metropolitan area that goes on forever and never stops, still honor our past with our agriculture and our economy with our agriculture? Because it's not just like, oh, we need to honor our heritage. It's no. Like we can grow food here, and having food autonomy is very important as well. Food independence is a huge and growing concern that I think a lot of people are recognizing should get more attention. But again, how do we preserve the agriculture and keep that as a real fundamental part of our economy and communities if there's a ton of growth? Like, what do we do?
Well, I think first and foremost, we listen to the farmers and the people that have been here a long time and get their input. Thank goodness Idaho farmers are really smart and, and wise. And one way that we're going to preserve food autonomy while still allowing for growth is that our yields are so much higher than they used to be. We can get a lot more, crops, food production off 1 acre land than we could 50 years ago. And so that is really what's saving us right now. Like, even though we have growth, we have agriculture in other areas of the state so we can still maintain that food autonomy. So I think you need to understand that, first of all,
we're not going to run out of food.
No. I mean, it's something to be mindful of. It's something to be careful about. But as far as, whether a farmer or landowner wants to keep farming, if that's what they'd like to do, we should provide a way for them to do that. I know that the Farm Bureau, they have a plan and they have a bill where you can enter into, basically just say, I intend to farm this piece of property for the next 10 years. And so if they agree to do that, then they can have access to their farmland. They can run their tractors on the roads. Like, no one can tell them they can't have heavy equipment on the roads, things like that, things that will enable them to keep farming. But I also understand that for many farmers, that's a retirement. They work their land their whole life and they intend to someday, sell that and either move somewhere else where they can buy more land and split it amongst their children, or maybe just retire. And, so I think we need to listen to the people that have been here the longest. And sometimes, they sometimes will come up with the best solution, and then we can codify that if we need to. And I really do speak with some experience because my dad's a farmer. And just 3 years ago, he sold our family farm and moved down here to a smaller area. And so I understand the, as you can tell, the emotion that goes into that, the loss of, what was, part of my childhood, part of my upbringing. Our family worked that land for a long time, but, that is the natural way of things. He's not going to be able to farm that piece of ground forever. And I'm grateful that he has now a nice, comfortable home that's close to where his children are. And so we can, be with him. And so I just think we need to respect those people that have worked the land for a long time.
I think that's really well said. It's my understanding that there's talk of attempting to bring some type of endowment or support for people that say, hey, look, I don't want to keep working in this way, but there's no one to buy this that intends to continue farming it, right? Like, I have this plot of land. I've worked it for a long time. The only people that want to buy it right now are developers. And it's my understanding that there is a program in the works that would essentially place that in an endowment or something that essentially provides some form of financial compensation for not selling it to developers and perhaps waiting a certain amount of time or assisting the farmer to wait a certain amount of time to see if they can get an agricultural buyer to keep farming. And are you familiar with this? Or am I totally?
I'm a little bit familiar.
Okay.
I think it's what I was talking about. I think that's fine. I think for most landowners who are going to sell, it's probably not going to be the practical choice. They are going to, probably end up selling to a developer because they're just going to get a lot more money. And, one thing about working your land for a long time is that was an investment. And so you want to get the highest return on your investment. Right. I mean, they're businessmen too. I mean, something to realize too is quite a lot of the land, and especially like in the Star and Middleton area, is already in the hands of land agents. It may still be being farmed, but it's being rented back to farmers and just waiting for the right time for development to come. So I think, the best thing that we can do is just have good comprehensive plans. Our cities, our counties should and do have like comprehensive plans, and just getting involved in citizens and making sure that those are are what we want. I think securing right-of-ways for future roads, for like our children and grandchildren is the thing that we can do now, making sure that they have, that we'll have good infrastructure. Infrastructure follows population. I mean, that's painful. We all hate it, but that is the way it is. But what we can do ahead of time is plan.
The alternative, I don't mean to interrupt, the alternative is the bridge to nowhere, right? Like, my dad lived in Anchorage for 25 years. So when like the Sarah Palin thing came through and the bridge to nowhere, he's like, oh no, it's over there. Look out the window. Like, that's it, which I thought was so funny because it really was like, this bridge to nowhere. And they're like, no, it'll be great. Like people will build over there. It's like, there's no one over there. Right. They're not just like, why wouldn't they just build right next door? Like they're not going to go over this bridge that doesn't have anything that people want. And then just like, we've struck it. Like, here it is. Like, what was that movie, Tom Cruise, Far and Away? Like he just goes off, do you like my hat? That was the worst Irish accent ever. But like, you know what I'm saying. Who was the actress in that movie?
Wasn't it Nicole Kidman?
Was it Nicole Kidman? Yeah. Oh my God.
Or maybe they were already together.
I don't know. God, that movie Eyes Wide Shut that they did together, what a weird movie. That came out when I was in college. I was like, I don't know what's going on in this movie, but I don't like it.
I did not see that one.
Yeah, it was really awkward. And interestingly enough, I read an article years later saying how it was like the most awkward experience to watch these two people that actually have a real intimate relation. Like they were married at the time, I think. And like, they were so awkward on film together, like portraying this intimate couple. It's like, is this how you guys are at like the actual dinner table? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah. So the infrastructure is going to follow population. So how do we plan for that though? Because we can't, how do we plan for that? How do we engage infrastructure ahead of time so we're not all just experiencing these? I have a friend who lives off of Linder. And he says, literally coming out of his little small community, making a left on Linder, he's like, you could be there for a half an hour. Like it's just a parking lot and nobody's going to let you in because they've been there for a half an hour too. Like, what do we do to avoid the half hour left turn?
Well, we need to get all the stakeholders involved. I imagine at Linder, that state and county highway district, right. Maybe the city of Meridian has some say in what happens there. If it's depending on what highway it turns onto, it could be, ITD, some ITD jurisdiction too. So bring all the stakeholders to the table. And then, they prioritize. They only get so much funding per year, and they prioritize. And, we all want lower taxes. And so we might have to wait a little bit to get some of that infrastructure if we're going to keep our taxes low. It's a trade-off.
Right. That's actually a really good point that I wanted to bring up when we were talking about education. The thing that I appreciate about Idaho is that they don't, other states, and particularly California, write budgets. So there's a real significant deficit in the thing everybody cares about, specifically education, right? So they'll fund the prison systems, they'll fund like all these other projects and then make this massive deficit in education and then get everybody to self-elect to tax themselves more because they're like, we have this huge deficit. It's like a $9 billion deficit. Like we have to fund this or your kids won't. It's like, why didn't you fund the schools first and then make everybody fight over the scraps for like the prison system? I'm not saying that's great policy. What I'm saying is it's one of those things where Idaho doesn't come with hat in hand, having made lives painful and detrimental and then say like, well, you have to tax yourself more. It seems that there is a degree of responsibility with that. So when you're saying, hey, look, we don't want more taxes and like, that means you're going to have to live with some stuff. It's like, yeah, I think that's a great trade-off.
Yeah. And I think that's when it's important to just listen to constituents and, and then, when it's wise to invest and when it's wise to like keep the taxes low and, wait for a while for those things to come. I do think that there's a problem in our state right now when it comes to education facilities. We have this huge backlog. I feel like we should have took better care of things over the last 20 years. And now we are going to have to pay for it a little bit. But luckily, our economy is doing well here in Idaho. And so we can use other tax revenues, sales tax revenues, and we can shift some of that school facility funding from local property taxes, which are out of whack right now, and move that to sales tax. And I see the legislature making moves to do that. And I think that's a great idea. It's not, we can't address that backlog in 1 year. We can't afford it. That's not fiscally responsible. And I would never want to do that. But we do need to play some catch up.
How do you feel property taxes are out of whack?
Well, I feel like because property values have gone up so much, so as property taxes or property values go up, then our taxes go up. And so right now, like the revenue source is too high from property taxes. Like we need to lower those rates and instead depend more on sales tax and things like that. And with sales tax, we can get people who don't live here and we can capture the income from places like that, especially places like Yellowstone.
Wait, back up. I'm not following you. Like, how do we get the sales tax from people that don't live here besides like transients going through the community?
Tourists, our tourist economy.
Do we have a tourist economy?
We have it. Yeah. We don't see it so much here in the Treasure Valley, but Coeur d'Alene,
Okay, yeah, no, but like
Yellowstone.
other place, yeah, no, listen, I'm with you there. Like I understand Coeur d'Alene, but like we're not talking about getting sales tax from McCall in your district, right? Or are you just saying that we need
The state collects
and then
sales tax
yeah,
revenue.
yeah.
So the state.
I thought you were implying that there was like this tourist hub in District 10. I'm like, have I missed something? like I love the Star Cafe, but I wouldn't say like people are coming out of state to have a breakfast. Okay, makes sense.
So at the state level, I think we need to do some shifting.
Okay. The sales tax here is, or excuse me, not sales tax, but property tax here is interesting to me because in California, people got worried about property tax as well, right? And that's how they passed Prop 13. I think it was in the 70s or 80s. But essentially, property values had skyrocketed, and they were like, property tax is now greater than people's mortgages and problems like that. So they actually stopped the Prop 13, put a cap on how much, once you purchase the property, it can only go up something like 3% a year, right? Mm-hmm. So the longer you've had the property, actually, the better return you get on it because, you're only going up 3%. But in Idaho, they don't have that, right? Like, or at least in the area I live, it's, hey, your property tax can go up an infinite amount. But the agencies and the districts that draw on that property tax have their budgets capped at a certain growth, right? So they can't say, hey, the values have gone up 20% or 30%. Let's just get 20 or 30% more. They have to, my budget was $1 million, for instance, last year, I can only go up to like $1,030,000 or something. Mm-hmm. So is there anything that you think would be appropriate in manipulating that equation, which is, hey, why don't we let the budgets go up a little bit less, or should we, like, is there anything there that you think would be relevant in manipulating?
Well, we did, I believe it was in 2021, capped the amount that a cities and counties can raise their budgets
right.
8%. So I mean,
is that it? It's 8%?
I believe 3%? So. And
okay,
then you can take another 3%
gotcha.
if you meet certain growth requirements. I just think we have to be careful. I mean, I think that is a move in a good direction, but we also have to make sure that we have enough funds in our city and county coffers to fund our police, because that is what the majority of cities, especially cities like Star and Middleton that are growing really fast, once they pay for their police force, like that's kind of the end of their budget right there. And so we do have to be careful. I think that maybe allowing, some looking at it and maybe just shaping it towards like the different needs of the community. Like if a community is growing faster, maybe we need to make some allowances there and things like that. I am not an expert on tax and rev. I would be happy to listen to lots of people who know more about it and consider different ideas.
Gotcha. Speaking of tax and revenue, coming back to education, what do you think about the tax credit? To allow the bill that would allow people essentially to take a credit to get their kids into private school using public funds.
Okay, so let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. So an education tax credit that people would use, they would take it off the top of their taxes as long as they could prove that their kid was enrolled in a private school or homeschooled, sure. Right? Okay, so that takes money right off the top of the revenue of the state of Idaho. And so that will not only affect education budgets, but it will also affect like ITD, transportation, roads and bridges budgets as well. So we give that money to people who want to send their kids to private school, and we're all going to be paying for that. And not just through the education system, but we're going to lose money for transportation and other things that the state funds, the Department of Agriculture, other things. So I think, we need to think about that as a state. Do we value people being able to send their kids to private school so much that we're willing to give up some roads and bridges for it? I believe that the most fiscally conservative thing to do is to fund our public education system and make it the best that it can be. That's my approach. I think that private school options are great, but I think that giving tax dollars to private institutions is not the way to go in the long run. Right now we have great private schools in Idaho: Bishop Kelly, Nampa Christian, Coal Valley Christian, great schools with rigorous academic programs and great kids there, cream of the crop. But if there's a pot of state tax dollars available, that could change. Our private schools may not be as rigorous and as good and as high of a standard because people will come in and see an opportunity to grab tax dollars. And I'm not going to encourage that.
So interesting point. I haven't heard somebody say that essentially there is obviously a blooming and flourishing private school industry in the area already. Like it almost seems like every other week you turn around, somebody's opening up like a hybrid school or, whatever it might be. And I'm not saying that's wrong, right? Like people absolutely, a lot of these are for-profit entities and wonderful. Like if you can make money, like I had a for-profit education company in California and it was just me, right? So it's not like, the 50 people, but I tutored kids for the SAT and it was math and grammar and all of the stuff. And I made a living off of doing it. And it was, the people could come in and exchange and they got value and it was great, right? The whole thing. But if you incentivize people, like one problem that I think is really prevalent is the solar industry in California, because because cost of electrical has gone up so high and there are federal dollars just flowing around, you have this incredibly painful industry. Like I've never met somebody who had a reasonable or easy time getting solar on their house, even though their electrical bills are like $800 a month, $1,000 a month. And every single time the company involved, the contractor involved would say like, yeah, look, I'm sorry, we're having a hard time getting people. Like we've grown 30% since last year and like 40% since last year. And it's like, okay, well, you wouldn't be doing that. Like you wouldn't get away with this if there wasn't all this money, right? Because there's just money everywhere. All of these kickbacks, all of these credits. If you didn't have that, you'd have more competition. You'd have fewer people getting it. You'd have fewer consumer dollars going into this stuff. And because of that, the companies would have to be, up to snuff, right? They would have to be actually treating their consumers not as just like as goofy as they were. So I hadn't actually heard that perspective, which is ultimately you'd create an industry that's bloated from government dollars flowing into the private sector, and you may actually have a decrease in quality in the private education system.
Yeah, I totally believe that would happen. I think there's people eager to grab those dollars for their own profit.
Yeah.
And I think that it creates these whole subsidiary businesses too. I was in California last summer at a basketball tournament and I was chatting with the lady next to me and she was from there. And I asked her what she did for a living and her job was to line people up with the right private school and get them funding, whether that was through private scholarships or like public grants that you could apply for and things like that. I mean, to me, it was like, I was like, oh, so you're like a lawyer for the private school system, like you have this whole industry based on like a government
navigating the bureaucracy, knowing what to apply for, when you have to get the essays in, what the essays have to be about. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, very nice lady. Like, I'm sure she knew her stuff, but I'm like, I hope I never meet anybody like, that has that job in Idaho. That is what I would want to avoid.
Yeah, it is really unfortunate. California is really... Anyway, so back to this. We're not there. So thank God for that.
Let's keep it that way.
Let's keep it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's another question. School choice, just in general. You were mentioning right before we went live that people have or will, and I didn't quite get what you were saying, people have or will have the ability to go in between districts, even if they don't live in that area. What were we talking about there? Yeah.
So that was actually a law that was passed last legislative session.
Legislative session. There you go.
Yes.
There you go.
That as long as a school district wasn't, I think it's like 90 or 95% full, that they could not refuse kids from other school districts. Okay. Which for much of the state was fine. And it was already being practiced anyway. But prior to that, that was a local decision, which I am in favor of local control. But the legislature made it a state statute that they have to let people in as long as they're not like at 90%. That is a problem for District 10 because our schools, if they are not over 90%, they are very close, but they have building permits issued that will more than fill them up. And so then the fact that they have to take kids in, even when they have all these like outstanding building permits, they know all these kids are coming, but they still have to let those kids come in. And that is not necessarily a problem, except that think about this. If a kid lives out of district and the school district passes a levy or passes a bond, that would be so great. Sure. that kid doesn't pay on that bond or that levy, that kid's family.
So if you have 10% of the population coming from outside the levy boundary, then those people are benefiting off of the other people's taxes.
Yes, property taxes, especially.
Oh, gotcha.
So, and, there are people in the community that are aware of that. And that was one of the hurdles that we had to try to overcome when we were trying to pass a bond in Middleton is they said, well, Middleton's open enrollment. They're letting all these kids in. Why should my property taxes pay for kids who don't live in our district? And at one time we could just say, well, that's a decision that's made by building, we don't let every kid in. But now we just say, well, we have to let them in. We don't really have a choice. That's out of our hands now.
Okay, so in general, you think it's a good idea. But again, we get back to the state versus local control, which is, look, what's good for Coeur d'Alene, what's good for Twin Falls may not be great for Middleton. And if Middleton wants to allow this, then it can.
Right.
And if they don't, okay, talk to me about principal conflict. Like, this is a perfect example of it, right? You take... In considering who to vote for, the constituents the voting citizens have to figure out, all right, look, who is this person and what have they been doing and why have they been doing it? And people delight in touting conservative principles like, oh, I voted for more local control versus state control. I voted for fiscal responsibility and decreasing the budget. And this person voted for, increasing the budget, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. But none of the bills are that cut and dry. Like every single aspect of every single bill has like some principal conflict where it's like, okay, what's the real conservative bill then? Like if people want to be a conservative purist, which is totally fine, like be whatever you want. Like how do we help people navigate or explain to people how we're navigating principal conflict? Because there's no perfectly crafted bill that like doesn't offend some liberal versus conservative concept.
Right. Or it has a lot of things woven into it that are seemingly unrelated.
Right. Well, even
bills,
education based, right? So like we had the two original library bills, one out of the Senate, one out of the House this session. And then there's another one up right now. And it's like there's no winning. Not a single bill makes everyone happy.
Right.
And like every aspect of one of the bills, it's like, okay, that's offending a liberal person or that's offending a conservative person. And there's no perfect solution. So how do we navigate that?
Well, I will say that the easiest thing to do is to just vote no. Because then you can always say, well, I was against, whatever funding, whatever, I tried to rein things in. That comes across as very conservative. However, voting no on everything is not really fulfilling your constitutional duty as a legislature. The reason that they convene and go into session every year is to fund the government agencies that are mandated by the Constitution, the Department of Education, the Department of Parks and Rec, the Department of Agriculture. That is their job. That's their job to fund it. And so, voting no on all funding bills is not really doing the work that you were sent to Boise to do. So I'll just start by saying that. As far as like identifying we're all trying to out conservative each other, right?
That's such a good way of putting it. Everybody's trying to out conservative the next person,
right?
Like I am the real conservative. And then there's the case to be made that even if people are voting in a conservative manner, the conservative decisions are philosophically liberal. And it's like my head just explodes when we say it. Like I can't track these arguments anymore. Like I don't know what to say. These are all Republicans. They all seem very conservative. And somehow you're like, yes, but deep down philosophically, like the way you're acting is not conservative. It's like, I don't even know what you're saying to me anymore. Yeah. Right? Like clearly you haven't hung out in Oakland, California recently because you would see some real not conservative people. Anyway, listen, back to you. So we're trying to out conservative each other.
Okay. Yes. So for me, I am a morally and ethically conservative person for sure. But when it comes to policy and government, one of the things I want to look at is just fiscal policy. Like, is this fiscally conservative? Because I think that's really where, like I said, that is the whole purpose the legislature convenes, is to take care of the fiscal business of the state. There may be times when the state government needs to get involved in some moral and ethical issues, but for the most part, I think those should be dealt with at the local level. And by local level, I mean family level, Like, I want to do whatever I can to keep our families strong. Okay, because keeping families strong is the most fiscally conservative thing you can do. If you have kids who are growing up, they learn to read, they learn to write, they understand the benefits of being a law-abiding citizen. They serve their neighbors, they take care of their elderly and their grandparents and things like that. That saves everybody money. We have lower healthcare costs, we have lower prison costs, all those things. We don't have as much trash on the streets. Our parks and our lakes and rivers and stuff are better taken care of if we just have good citizens. That is the most fiscally conservative thing that we can do, is strengthen families. So that's the place that I come from when we're talking about being conservative.
Yeah, and to that end, you have somebody who does all of these things, takes care, respects their elders, takes care of their community, does all of this stuff. They're probably going to be gainfully employed and happily working along. Where you really fall into traps is where you have people that just are maladapted for contemporary society. They don't get on with their family. They have no skill sets. They're, disdainful of anyone trying to clean up the community. And they're just, it's those are not people that are going to be helping, right? They're kind of a drain. And then you get into all kinds of government programs because now we have to support them. And then the jail systems get overflowed with people that just have nothing, anyway, you know the spiral.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a such thing as bad luck, especially when we're talking about health problems, and then there's generational issues that we can't, just blame on these poor kids who grew up in these horrible families. Right. But if we can create and support of strong families within a community, they can help each other out, and they can inspire kids who maybe come from, less than ideal home, if they are exposed to a more ideal home, if they're exposed to an inspiring teacher, maybe they can correct some of that in the next generation. And like I said, I think that's the most fiscally conservative thing that we can do, is really strengthen families.
We've talked a lot about education, infrastructure, growth. What are the problems that you see, right? Because you're not running for, the Senate because it's good for your health, right? This is not everyone that I speak with, either the representatives and senators that are in office right now or the people that are running. It's not a burden necessarily, but it's hard. The whole thing is hard. It's just a dump truck of difficulty. And I so respect those people. And I even the people running, we owe the people running a debt of gratitude because they're attempting to step forward to improve something that they think. So what is that thing that you're really stepping forward? Because you're hey, look, this is a problem. And the existing person that's in the seat is not addressing this problem either sufficiently or quickly enough. And I think I have something to add here that's not finding representation from someone else. What is that thing?
Well, first, I just want to say that I am so grateful that I am in a position where I can run. Not everyone is. I mean, I just have a super supportive husband. I mean, he should be here. You would love him. He's just great.
Bring him next time.
I have great kids, and I'm not a caregiver for an elderly parent, and I don't have a child with severe mental problems or something like that. So I am just blessed and grateful that this is something that I can do. And I'm eager to serve. I like serving my community. This is definitely a more public way than I've ever done it before, but I'm grateful that I'm able to do it. As far as I had some opportunities to run for different things before, but I was no, I think the person in there is doing a good job. There's no reason for me to do that. I'll just keep staying in my lane here. But because I was so involved in the Middleton School District and in public education, I did start to feel like our current representative wasn't doing a good job. And I felt not only kind of back to what I said, I just felt some of the things that she was proposing or, doing were not fiscally conservative. And that really concerned me because like I said, I think that's really our job as legislators, is to take care of taxpayer money and to be good stewards over the taxpayers' money. And I just feel I do have something to add to that conversation. I would like to work on the school funding system or school funding formula. And I do want to take care of our rural schools. Middleton and Star and Nampa aren't as rural as they used to be, but we need to keep our rural schools strong because our rural communities, that is where our agriculture takes place. That's where our forestry, our timber industry, those things. And so we benefit from having strong rural communities, even in Star, Middleton, and Nampa. And so we need to make sure that they have good schools too.
Right. And even though the means of production, right, the economy in a rural area might be agriculture, doesn't mean that those kids are not deserving of as good an education as anyone else. And like I have a family member that grew up in Montana, right, and they moved around because they had to move around because the school systems that she was engaged in as a young person were like they didn't have anything past like fourth grade. They're like, your kid knows everything in the district. Like, we're not going to teach her anything. And they had to physically move several times to keep this person engaged and going. And they were lucky they were able to do it. But that's not something, especially if you're tied to an agricultural economy, you're not just going to be able to like get up and move, right?
Right.
Thankfully, the parents involved were able to do that. But again, people shouldn't have to move across the state because you're like, hey, you happen to be really, really smart. And we think the best path for your progress and growth as a person really lies in enhanced education. And we just have nothing to offer you, right? Mm-hmm. So like move 300 miles away. Mm-hmm. That's an unfortunate position to be in.
Right.
Right. Were you going to say something? We both took a breath at the same time.
Well, I will just reiterate that, yeah, strengthening our rural communities starts with the schools. I mean, people would have more of a desire to live there and stay there and work in agriculture and forestry and things like that if they knew it was a great place to raise a family. And yes. One thing that makes it a great place to raise a family is having a really good, strong education system. And private schools are not going to come into those small rural areas the way that they will into the Treasure Valley or maybe Idaho Falls or Coeur d'Alene. There just isn't the market for it. It doesn't make sense for them to do that. And some people will say, well, they can do it online. Well, I don't want my kids online school all day.
Okay. Listen, what do you think about all the tech in schools these days?
All the tech in schools these days. Well, that's kind of a loaded question. I mean, we certainly
What do you think about kindergartners walking around with Chromebooks?
I don't think they should be. Last I knew, at my school, they have a cart of Chromebooks. And when it is time to work on the Chromebooks, they go check them out, bring them back to their desk. When they're done with that particular exercise, they take them back. I was fine with that, because I do think that not only do young kids need to learn about technology, the truth is they probably already know about it. And there's a lot of cool tools that we can use in technology. But it certainly doesn't replace books, and it doesn't replace, classroom instruction. It also doesn't replace hands-on learning. It's just a component of learning. We need to make sure it's like an appropriate segment of learning, but doesn't overtake it.
I have a friend, Max. He's kind of snarky. I enjoy him. I've known him since we were 18. We went to college together. We were on the phone the other day, and he has 4 boys, very similar to my ages. And he said, look, iPhone came out in like 2007 or 8 or something. Mm-hmm. And he's like, from 2000, let's say 8 until now, everybody gets a pass on, what you have become because of your phone. But at this point, we all know like what technology does to people. 100%. There's no denying it. You know the risk to old people. You know the risk to young people. The neurologists know the risks. Everyone knows the risks. So when we talk about tech in schools, and as you're saying, there are a lot of cool tools. Yeah, there are some really cool tools. I have a Japanese knife that's really cool and it's really, really sharp. But that doesn't mean that really cool tool is not without its risks. And this is one of the interesting things that I think people are coming to terms with, or at least starting to recognize, which is, hey, like, it's not like we're getting a new textbook or you're getting a new calculator and these are new tools, which they are. It's not like you're getting a different, busing system that gets people there faster and more efficient. Like, that's not what this is. We are actually getting something that, has an infinite amount of options, but it is not without a human cost. Are you worried about that for our schools? Or do you think that that's something that, will essentially just work out and the schools are doing a good job managing?
No, I'm worried about it. It's definitely a concern. I think most educators, are aware of that too, and they know it's a concern. It is a balance. They have a responsibility to teach kids the tools that those kids will probably end up using in their jobs. I mean, look at the tech that we're surrounded by right now, So kids do need to learn those things, but it doesn't replace, classroom instruction and things like that.
Okay, but you and I did not grow up with this. That's my point. This argument that like the educators need to teach kids the tools that they're going to utilize in their employment. This laptop did not exist when I was a kid. Like, these cameras did not exist. I didn't know anything about audio, video, editing, and engineering until 2019. And I was like in my late 30s, right? Like, the argument that, hey, they're going to engage in like a laptop or word processor when they're gainfully employed at either, say, 18 or let's say after college, 22, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe, but why now? Right? Like, why give it to all of the kids now and in this way? And again, I'm not trying to hold you accountable for things that school districts are doing. It's just, again, on the state level, it's curious to me because nobody's talking about, hey, there are these real risks, and the state is funding technology that gets put into young people's hands. And like, who's mentioning the risk? Like, who's mentioning the potential cost? And the argument again is, well, they're probably engaged with technology. Yeah, they're probably doing a lot of things that the public schools should not be engaged in, right? That was always the argument that's actually a contemporary argument for what I would consider pornography in public libraries in other states. They're like, they can find it all on their phones. It's like, yeah, maybe they can. That's a private cell phone, right? And that's on their personal time. It's not when you're at a public school, and it's not in a public school library. These are different things, right? The state should not be engaged in disseminating pornography, right? And again, Idaho doesn't have the problems that California has with that. But like, that is something that I think the state is going to have to eventually come to terms with, which is you're providing this technology, and like, what's the conversation around keeping people safe with that technology?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think that's a conversation that needs to be happening now and needs to keep happening in the future. Like, are we overusing these tools, that we have available in the school?
Right.
Are we? Yeah.
Right. We have a hammer.
Yeah.
We're just hitting everything like it's a nail. It's like boom, 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 just whack-a-mole. It's like, but like, should we be swinging the hammer like this? Right.
Maybe we need to get back to some more basics.
Yeah.
Basic way of learning. And you're right. I think that there's time for them to learn some of that later.
Right. Well, I certainly did.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you could too. If another program comes out, you get, say you go, you do gain the Office, and they're like, hey, you need to learn this new program on this new system. You're like, all right, well, let's get after it. Like, this is how you do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there does need to be some basic learning that takes place. Like, I think that most jobs now would assume that you have some familiarity with like a word processing software.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
And there are going to be some kids who aren't going to get that at home, right? There's quite a few kids in our district. They may have phones, but they don't have like actual computers. So that's different. They wouldn't have that work experience. Same with maybe like spreadsheets, different things like that. So
I hate spreadsheets. I hate them. I hate every second on Google Sheets. I hate you, Google Sheets.
Lucky for you, there's so many people who love spreadsheets. So
I'm not that guy. Like, I don't love like all the little commands and the programming, and like, I even like coding. I don't like doing spreadsheets. They just, they make I start itching. It's terrible. Lori, we have spoken for a long time about a myriad of things. Is there anything we've missed?
Well, I did want to speak a little bit to the Republican Party, and there's a caucus coming up. Maybe by the time this airs, the caucus will be over. But
when is it coming up?
Saturday.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Saturday is the caucus, and it's in person only. I just want to say that, I'm being challenged all the time, like, as not being a real Republican, even though I was born and raised in Idaho and have always been a Republican. I am an open-minded Republican, so I will listen to other people, but my priority as a policymaker would be being fiscally conservative. I may have some in my own party come out against me because it's a race between two Republicans, maybe more. The filing period has not ended yet, but I would just say that to anyone in District 10, like, if you don't know me personally, then you can give me a call and I'd love to get to know you. And if you don't have time for that, you might know somebody who knows me personally. On my website, I have a lot of support from my friends and people in the district who have worked with me, whether it's been in my church or my school or, in other capacities in the community. So I would just urge you to, rather than believe, some advertisement or something you see on social media, talk to somebody who knows me.
Man, the getting away, I've been talking to a number of people about this, like, recognizing as we come into the election of this year, it's like, listen, everybody needs to get their head on straight and recognize that what happens online is just going to be a nightmare. Like we're all going to face this dumpster fire of insanity. And I was I don't want to say disheartened. It was a bummer to see. I don't even live in Eagle, but I was covering a lot of the Eagle elections this last fall. And it was a real distressing thing to see people get so worked up. You had neighbor against neighbor, and so much of it was being manipulated by PACs that had no one to answer to. You know, they were running ridiculous flyers and spreading all kinds of ridiculous lies. Like, oh my God, man, come on. And by the way, where are those PACs after the election? It's not like they're sitting everybody down saying, okay, now listen, I know we said some crazy stuff, but you guys are still friends. Remember, you're still friends. There's none of that. Like the people pulling the strings and upsetting everyone and trying to weaponize their distrust and disdain and frustration, which is what they do. They get people in a lather and then say, hey, I'm the solution. Those people are not in it for our community. Those people are in it for other reasons, right? Like somebody in it for the community would actually be sitting people down saying, all right, listen, we're neighbors. We probably want the same thing at the end of the day. We just have different ways of going about it. Let's talk about what you think. Let's talk about what I think. Let's figure this out. Right. And nobody's going to be able to get everything they want. That's why we compromise a little bit. But I think we can move the needle, right? Like, let's work together. And yes, you're a good person. And I would like to think I'm a good person. And that's okay. Like we can both be good people and not agree with each other. That's great. But man, just I'm already getting stressed out. Like it's going to be so bad this year. Yeah. It's going to be brutal. Anyway, so hopefully it doesn't in District 10.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, party politics is kind of crazy right now. It is. And there's a lot of people out there muddying the waters. And I think, you know, when people see something online or on social media, and they might want to just ask themselves the question, what is this person putting out there? Are they trying to get their message out and what they want to accomplish? Or are they just trying to confuse and muddy the waters and, you know, try and create vitriol and contention within our community? And if the answer to that question is yes, then maybe seek some information from the source. You know, I would love to talk to you. Like my email address is out there. I answer emails. So reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate you trying to push the state forward. Win, lose, or draw. Again, thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
MTU Studios is the proud producer for the Ada County Sheriff Podcast, the Idaho Wildlife Federation Podcast, the State Representative Ted Hill Podcast, the Idaho State PTA Podcast, and many more. If you or your organization is thinking about starting a podcast, MTU Studios would love to help. Just check out mtustudios.com.